only thing that actually cut spending in Washington in real terms for, well, goodness gracious, a number of years. Now that we've undone that, we can get around to debating and passing the $1.1 trillion discretionary spending bill. The deal was hatched in December, as you know. I was opposed to it, and now they're putting on the final, crossing the final T's, dotting the final I's. So what better time to have our young man, our young friend back, and at my age, anybody is young. Jonathan Bydlak is president of the Coalition to Reduce Spending. Now, he started out in finance, a hedge fund analyst, but you may know Jonathan Bydlak as director of Ron Paul's 2008 fundraising campaign, primarily online social media, and amassing tens of millions of dollars. Did a great job there, and they're doing a great job as president of Coalition to Reduce Spending, which is really the right target, Jonathan. No matter how we finance government, whether we tax, whether we inflate, whether we borrow, it all comes out of the private sector. So we really have to focus on spending.
Well, that's right, and thanks for having me on. You know, Milton Friedman, of course, famously said that the true cost of government is not what it taxes, but what it spends.
That's right.
And the reality is that, you know, part of the reason why we have an incentive to increase taxation is because of the fact that we're spending on a lot of things that we shouldn't be spending on. And so if you end up going and getting the spending problem under control, you also deal with the taxation problem as well.
Yeah, this was always sort of the supply side defect. I fancy myself a supply sider. I do think at some point a Laffer curve kicks in, and you're going to, at the very least, not lose as much revenue. As Milton Friedman also said, if you cut taxes and revenue increases, you haven't cut them enough. My favorite line. But you know, you can cut taxes, and indeed, if you're still spending, you're going to have problems. You're going to, now you can grow out of some of that, and we did grow out of it to a large degree during the 80s and 90s, but there's no way we're ever going to grow out of this.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think, you know, there's an even more fundamental question, which is simply, you know, where do you expect the most good to be done with the resources that society has? Do you believe that the public sector is the best place to, you know, carry out all the sort of programs that we see? Or do you believe that the people who are sort of earning the money and are best suited to decide for themselves how best to spend it? And, you know, I think that the evidence is pretty clear over the last century that you know, free market systems and allowing private individuals to take responsibility for the wealth that they earn is ultimately best, not just for those people, but for society as a whole.
Well, of course it is, and indeed there is no profit motive, there is no market discipline at the federal, state, or local level. They will never spend the money as efficiently because nobody's got their own money at stake. So what's the point of efficiency?
That's exactly it, and it really does come all down to incentives. You know, that at the end of the day, you know, if you're an elected official, you know, what are your incentives when it comes down to spending? Well, you know, most elected officials end up, you know, going back to their district and kind of bragging about the pork funding that they've been able to bring back, or you know, they end up getting large campaign contributions from special interests. And so, in the current political climate, there really isn't, you know, much on the side of decreasing spending unless, you know, you're someone who's sort of ideologically, you know, predisposed to that way of thinking. And unfortunately, as we can see with this, you know, omnibus spending bill being debated, you know, that is not a majority of our elected officials at this point.
So then, should we go back to a balanced budget amendment? Or is that the wrong focus, i.e., would you rather have a budget of $3.5 trillion that's balanced, or a budget that's out in deficit mode, out of balance, but the total spending is only $1 trillion?
Yeah, I think balanced budgets are valuable, but they're not the one-size-fits-all solution. You know, we most states, as you know, have balanced budget requirements, and of course, there are many ways in which they get around those requirements. And
they have capital budgets too. Yeah, right.
So, you know, I would imagine that a similar phenomenon would occur at the federal level if we were to pass a balanced budget amendment. And then I think just on a practical level, you know, there's a certain amount of difficulty in this climate to you know, actually amending the Constitution in that way. And so, you know, I tend to be more of a fan of statutory means, and you know, I think that the Budget Control Act was actually was pretty solid over the last 2 years. You know, Stephen Moore wrote, of course, the Wall Street Journal article talking about how total spending, you know, aggregate spending actually went down the last 2 years, and that was, you know, for the first time since the Korean War. And so these are the kinds of rules that I think we need in place. And then, of course, we need to actually hold our elected officials accountable when they decide to go back on those rules.
Well, the first thing we have to understand is we ought not give a damn about the government's budget. We ought to care about the family's budget, the businessman or woman's budget, the country's private sector budget. But all we hear about is, we've got to do something about the deficit. The government will be out of balance. Well, yeah, you can raise taxes until the government's in balance, but the money's coming from someplace. So you're just robbing Peter to pay Paul. So we've got to, it's a little bit like the old Clinton era tax increases to reduce the deficit. You could, if you have an economy of $100 total GDP, and you've got a deficit of $10, you can raise enough revenue, and you'll close the deficit, but the GDP will shrink from 100 to 90. Now, who's better off?
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I think, there's always room for debate on revenue, and that's, my personal view is that we shouldn't be focusing on revenue because we have spending is the source of our problem. Right. But I think the thing that a lot of people fail to talk about is the fact that when we look back at the 80s and we had sort of deficits that we ran then. Right. The big difference between then and now was that the private sector was doing really well. The private sector was actually in surplus and was lending money to the public sector. But today we have the public sector, the government, running massive deficits at the same time while the private sector is not doing well. And so we don't really have a situation where you can't rob Peter to pay Paul.
Right. And your old boss used to talk about this quite a bit. With the easy fiat money, what the Fed has done is it's induced a debt crisis across the spectrum, not only at the governmental level, but in the private sector. We've created a classic Austrian boom and bust America. And so that's why I said earlier, Jonathan, we're not growing out of this. Coming out of World War II, when we downsized, we could grow out of 100% GDP spending. Even coming out of the 80s and the Cold War peace dividend and the private sector growth, as you mentioned, you could grow out of that, which we did. But we have structural government deficits and entitlement that are fostered by this fiat money that has induced private sector debt as well. How do you grow out of that?
Yeah, I think growth is obviously has to be part of the picture. But what you're pointing out is that it can't be the only picture. The only solution here. The question is sort of how do you get growth? And the reality is that the only way you're ultimately going to get that is by focusing on spurring the private sector. And the way to do that is, of course, by reducing the sort of intervention that we have by government into that private sector. And until we actually go and commit ourselves to that right. Those kind of solutions, we're just not going to see a change from the status quo in terms of our economic prosperity.
Yeah, and Coalition to Reduce Spending is all about that because not only does increased spending and taxes reduce incentive, but increased deficits, as you point out, crowd out capital markets, and if you monetize the debt, you get all sorts of market dislocations and artificial bubbles and interest rates far too low for anybody's good, quite frankly. So there simply is no free lunch, and we're finding that out right now with this horribly anemic growth. Let's come back and talk about some spending areas when we return, especially this omnibus bill that they're debating now, the unemployment benefits coming up again, transportation, Ray LaHood back with his gas tax, Obamacare. Jonathan Bydlak, president of Coalition to Reduce Spending on the Jason Lewis Show.